Please welcome Oli Isaacs.
I come here via Los Angeles, but I'm originally from London in England, which explains the accent. I work at Windish Agency, and I also run my own management company called This Is Music. This Is Music is based in London still. We have 6 staff there. I should tell you a bit about myself before talking about how creativity can become your business. I've been a fan of music from an early age. My parents introduced me to the classics of the 60s and the 70s, Van Morrison, the Grateful Dead, Hendrix. And I went to college and did a law degree. And I became a criminal barrister, which is like a criminal defense attorney. I was aiming to work in human rights law. I had never thought about how you could work in the music business. I didn't even really know there was a business. I was just a fan of music. I ended up doing run-of-the-mill criminal work. I didn't do the human rights work that I had believed in passionately, and I ended up starting to think things hadn't panned out for me to be happy in my work. I didn't like the clients. I ended up in corporate law and started to think about how I could marry up my interest in music with gainful employment. I'd started running a monthly party in an East London pub, which booked both bands and DJs, and that was my intro into the music business. We lost quite a bit of money doing that. I ended up meeting some of my future clients there, and managed eventually to persuade a music law firm to take me on as a lawyer. One thing led to another, and I started managing some of my legal clients. And eventually, I left the law firm to start a management company, and that was a little under 10 years ago. It's been an interesting ride ever since. Wrong way. So, This Is Music is an artist management company. We're very much driven by the artists. We look for music that we love first and foremost. And then we look for people we can work with. We're not always looking for the biggest growth potential. Some of our artists are resolutely underground, or they're operating in the space between the underground and crossover. We like it there. There's less compromises to be made. But of course, with less compromises, there's also less money. About 3 years ago, I moved to America. My wife is American, and she got offered a great job in LA, and she said, "Do you want to go live there?" And I was like, "Fine, let's do it." We moved, and around that time, Tom Windish at the Windish Agency recruited me to join his team. That's some of the artists we work with at This Is Music. There's 12 of them, and this is the Windish Agency. It's an independent booking agency devoted to artistic development and the vision of the incredibly talented roster. We've emerged as one of the most innovative leaders in key aspects of the music industry, both booking shows and helping artists connect with the fans, and we're committed to sustainable, long-term success. The company was created by Tom Windish in 2004 out of a Chicago apartment with only 2 employees, 50 bands, and a commitment to doing something unique. Now, the Windish Agency has around 700 artists, and we have 6 offices across the US and Canada. We're booking around 14,000 gigs a year. So, of the people in the room tonight, how many of you are creative? Just a good amount. How many of you believe that your creativity can truly be your business? It's a good amount as well, but slightly less than the number of creative people. And of those people who believe that creativity can be their business, how many of you believe that there may be a need at some point to sell out if you want to have success? That's a small number. Okay, interesting. There's no right or wrong answer to that. Part of what we're talking about here is the balance between art and commerce. It's somewhat a marriage of convenience. There's a fine line between the interaction of the products of your creativity and the marketplace that are governed by the simple economics of supply and demand. Those products are consumed by people in the marketplace. And it means that the purest form of creativity, unfettered creation of art without regard to commercial factors, is not what this talk is about. This is not about defining your creativity. This is more about a one-size-fits-all strategy or an introduction to that strategy that can help you get your business off the ground. The balance that you take between art and business is really up to you. I've worked with some inspiring artists who have no sense of business at all, and some who didn't care much about money. They left that to us, and they hired us to think about business for them and to care about money for them. On the other hand, I've worked with some artists who gave me an education in being in business, an education in marketing, an education in brand building, and I learned more from those guys than I did going to school to take a law degree. Unfortunately, I've had no real formal education in the music business. It's really just the experiences I've had over the last 10 years. But no matter what balance you strike, for me, the baseline definition of success, for the purposes of this talk at any rate, is being able to work in your creative endeavors for as long as you like to do it. Later on, we're going to touch on the concept of micro-businesses and how we use that term to define what we do as managers for some of our clients. Simply put, a micro-business is one that has between 5 and 10 employees and grosses no more than 1 million a year. The basic concept applies in the music industry to almost any genre, and it can apply to any musician, whether you're aspiring to be Drake, Aphex Twin, or even Taylor Swift. So, I suppose the boring part of running a business is work. Even if you have a team of people hired to do work for you, you're still going to have to work incredibly hard. Jay-Z works incredibly hard at the top of the game, and people starting out at the bottom are no different, except they get paid a lot less for it. Setting up in business on your own is incredibly daunting because not only do you have to believe in what you're doing creatively, but you have to believe in having a whole load of other skills that perhaps aren't as immediately apparent as your ability to play the piano, DJ, play the guitar, the drums, whatever instrument you play, or to sing. It seems obvious, but it's worth mentioning at this point, and I won't dwell on it. But when it comes to developing the craft, work is the thing that lies at the heart of creativity. In a very competitive market, and it's increasingly more competitive, that is what separates the successful elite from the rest of the field. I don't know how many of you are familiar with Malcolm Gladwell's books, but he has a book called Outliers, in which he discusses how talent and success are related. And in the book, he says that it takes roughly 10,000 hours of practice to achieve mastery in a field. How does Gladwell arrive at this conclusion? He didn't just pick the number out of thin air, he went and looked at some research. And if the conclusion is true, how can we then leverage this idea to achieve greatness in our chosen creative professions? Gladwell studied the lives of extremely successful people to find out how they achieved success. He looked at violinists in Berlin. In the early 90s, a team of psychologists studied a bunch of violin students, and specifically their childhood practice habits. They were all asked the question, over the course of your entire career, ever since you picked up the violin, how many hours have you practiced? All of the violinists began playing at roughly 5 years of age, with similar practice times. However, at age 8, practice times begin to diverge. By age 20, the elite performers averaged more than 10,000 hours of practice each, whilst less able performers only were practicing around 4,000 hours. The elite had double the practice time of the rest of the field. One fascinating point in the study was that natural talent was really not a factor. There were no naturally gifted performers emerging in the field who did not need to put in the time. If natural talent had played a role, we'd expect those guys to float to the top, but they did not. The psychologists found a direct statistical relationship between hours of practice and achievement. There were no shortcuts to be taken. One of the other examples that Gladwell gives in his book is a little-known band by the name of the Beatles. The Beatles played shows in Hamburg before they were well known, and they were playing up to 5 shows a night. Unpaid, bad acoustics, audiences that were unappreciative. Does any of this sound familiar? Maybe if any of you have played live shows, you'll know how they felt. What did they get out of that experience? They got playing time. Non-stop hours of playing time that forced them to improve. As they grew in skill, the audiences demanded more performances, more playing time, and by 1962, they were playing 8 hours a night, 7 nights a week. By 1964, they'd burst onto the international scene, and they'd played over 1,200 concerts together. By comparison, most bands don't play 1,200 times in their entire career. The acceleration between being on the internet on SoundCloud with your demos and playing shows now is ridiculously fast compared to the pre-internet era, and we'll deal with the impact of the internet shortly. One thing I will say about practice and about work and about putting in the hours is the idea of falling in love with the craft, falling in love with the work. The elite don't just work harder than everybody else. At some point, the elite fall in love with practice to the point at which it is no longer work. The elite football player is the guy who goes home every day to watch videos of practice. The elite physician is the guy or girl who goes to listen to medical podcasts in the car on the commute. The elites are in love with what they do, and it isn't really work. Overnight success is not really something that I'm here to talk about. It's not really something that I believe occurs. The people who you think have had overnight success have been working 4 years without anybody knowing what they were doing. It's not to say it never happens, but it's rare, and it's often more about perception than about reality. Most artists really do start from the bottom and build their businesses gradually in increments. And that's really what we're here to talk about. How do you start out? What are the principles of business as a musician, as an artist, that you need to be considering? The key really is to look at how you can run a business on any scale, not simply how you get to be Jay-Z or Drake or any of the artists who have a perfume deal or a clothes line. You know, those things are nice. Those things may be on the agenda for some of you. But ultimately, we're talking about how do you get to do what you do creatively for as long as you want to do it. So one of the first things that I wanted to talk about really is funding. Any business is going to need cash flow. And one of the interesting things about where we are now in the music industry is that we're in a time of great change. Everything's been in flux over the last 10 years, and I often talk to the people I work with who've only been doing this 2 or 3 years, and we talk about 10 years ago in the record business when it was possible for the vast majority of artists to sell records. I remember reading a book about the Jesus and Mary Chain, a Scottish band who were on Creation Records. And their first 7-inch single, which came out in the 80s, sold 70,000 physical 7-inches, which, you know, compared to some people's SoundCloud hits now, sounds like a very small amount. But nobody is selling 70,000 7-inches at all in 2014. So, firstly, what do you need funding for? Well, that's a very good question. And there's a good argument that you don't really need funding for a lot, but you're going to need some. The DIY model only goes so far when it's just yourself. You're occasionally going to need to be able to buy things and hire teams and services to help you as you go along your DIY route. Where do you get the cash from if you're not signing to a friendly record label or in a publishing deal? My argument generally to the artists that I manage is that you really shouldn't be looking to record labels or to publishers for the first 5 years of your career. Sometimes it happens sooner than that, but generally you need to make a plan without thinking about those guys. Because those guys generally will require you to deliver them too much in terms of rights, in terms of commitment, and they'll shackle what you're doing. But also, they're not going to be there for most of the people who want to be creative and who want to be musicians. The fact of life is, of all the people who are wanting to have a business in music, there are not going to be enough record deals and publishing deals to go around. There is not enough external funding. So if you're not getting your check cut from Island Records or from Sony, where are you getting the money from when you need to hire a publicist, or when you need to make tape cassettes, or when you need to go on the road and you need money for gas? This is hard advice to take, but believe me, it's true. Part-time, flexible work is the way forward if you want to start a business in music. So you basically have to suck it up, and you have to find some way of bringing in money to pay your rent and also to pay for other things, and you have to be prepared to make sacrifices. This talk could get super boring super fast, if I continue to talk about hard work and making sacrifices and getting part-time jobs. So I should touch on a couple of other ways that there are to look at funding. The traditional music industry I've already talked about, and it is an option for some people, but I wouldn't count on it. Crowdsourcing, we heard somebody talking about Kickstarter earlier. Kickstarter is one of many crowdsourcing options. Again, it fits some models better than others. It's not the answer to every problem, and again, I wouldn't rely on it, but you should know that it's there and you should investigate it, because potentially if you have an idea which is Kickstartable or crowdfundable, then it's worth pursuing. My wife and I, 3 years ago, kickstarted a small music festival, which is now in its year 3, and we used Kickstarter the first year. It worked okay for us. We didn't love it, we didn't use it again, but it made us the money to put on a festival. The other way of getting some funding is what I call the Montreal model. I don't know if anybody here is from Montreal, possibly not. The Québécois French-Canadian government is fantastic at giving out grant funding to people who live in various parts of Quebec. And this applies to England and Wales, and I assume it applies to various states in the US as well. But there are public funds available for people involved in creative endeavors. You have to really know how to go about getting them. I am not somebody who knows about how to go and get them, otherwise I would be in a better position to talk about it, but those things do exist. The key, though, when you do have some funding, whether it be from your part-time work, whether it be from a small record deal, a publishing deal, or indeed from reinvesting what you're earning playing music, is to keep your costs low. Reinvest what you make if you believe in your business, and cash flow it, as I said, with other work that you do. What kinds of things are you going to need to fund? Well, initially, you're going to need to create some product. One of the great things about living in 2015 as opposed to being around in the 60s and 70s is the democratization of the means of production. What do I mean by that? What I mean is, gone are the days of having to go to Abbey Road Studio in London, where the Beatles recorded, or indeed the Village in Santa Monica in LA, where Fleetwood Mac spent $1 million recording Tusk. I mean, it's crazy to think about people spending $1 million recording an album now. I've made records for no money. I've made records for $20,000. I've made records for all sorts of amounts, but $1 million sounds like a hell of a lot of money to make an album, particularly when it's going to be streamed for free on SoundCloud or YouTube, or indeed pirated on BitTorrent sites. I'm not saying there's no difference between the traditional studios and a simple laptop monitor speakers MIDI keyboard setup. Of course there is a big difference between the two things. And I'm sure that you guys learn about that in school here. But these days, if you have a computer and a pair of speakers and some talent, you can record an album or indeed a track which is as good and which sounds almost as good or sounds as good and can compete in the market with anything by the Beatles or Fleetwood Mac or indeed Drake or Jay-Z. I'm not here really to argue about analog versus digital, or indeed to debate rock versus electronic, but the simple fact is you could take $500 and you could go onto eBay, and with a bit of luck you could purchase second-hand equipment on which you could make a track which could be the top of the Billboard chart. That is not a joke, that is a fact. The means of production have truly been democratized. You may not even need to buy the gear yourself. It may be possible for you to take it on loan, find a friend who has the right studio set up for you. It can be done on almost any budget. The studio that you choose to use, or the instruments you choose to work with, are the core tools of your business. They are your means of production. More people than ever are making music, and this is a great thing because there's more music than ever being made. It's also somewhat of a problem because it's really hard to get ahead. If you go on to, whether it be YouTube or SoundCloud or Bandcamp or any of the other plethora of sites, there is literally too much music. We have a whole team of people who are engaged in what is called A&R, looking for new artists, looking for good music. It's an impossible task. You could spend all day, every day doing it, and you would still not be able to listen to everything, which is part of the problem. Because if the people who are doing the A&R, whether they be at major labels, big management companies, small management companies, booking agencies, they're all engaged in this process of looking for talent. If they can't listen to all the music, how do they know where the next Beatles are? How do they know where the next Hendrix is, the next Jay-Z, the next Drake, the next whoever, the next Madonna? It's an impossible task. which causes a daunting problem for all of us. It's important to talk about the barriers for entering the market having been lowered, because they've really created this situation in which you have to be smarter at running a business in order to be able to get ahead in the first place. But once you have your means of production, you can get started running your business. You really don't need a great deal of anything else. My only advice in terms of starting to produce or starting to play is really to keep it simple initially. So these are just some of the points that I'm going to cover, talking about like how to start thinking about how to run your business. And I've broken it down maybe in like a slightly unglamorous kind of way, because these are terms that you could apply pretty much to running any business. You could be making tins of beans, and you would still want to cover these 6 points. First of all, researching the market. And that's something that maybe is not something that you need to do in a formal sense. It's something that maybe a lot of you do every day anyway. You can do it online. You can do it by going to shows. You can do it by talking to people. It's really a question of knowing, as a musician, as a band, as a performer, as an artist, where do you fit? It's about knowing your niche. Different areas of music, different genres, have different substructures in terms of the way in which the business is applied to them. And from that point of view, knowing about these will help you make key choices in terms of the product you make, the team you build, the way you take your products to market, the venues you play in. For example, if you make black metal, you will use different tools and work a different model than if you're choosing to make EDM. The overall structure of your business, though, will likely be the same. The same principles will apply. But knowing what part of the music business you're in and learning something about your competitors and the main players in that part of the industry and what they're doing is likely to help you. Again, if you're making EDM, there's no point going to Nashville looking to cut songs. It's just not going to happen there. So once you've researched the market and you know what niche you're in and where it's going to fit, you need to start to think about product development. And product development is not just about making a track, making an album. It's about making music, performing music, but it's broadly about content. There's a saying in marketing generally, and advertising now too, that content is king, and it's probably the truest thing that anybody can tell you about how to market music. There are two, I think, guiding principles for me in terms of the content that you make. Firstly, content is everything. It's audio content, audio-visual content, visual content, and everything that you do online is going to be in this realm of content. It's not something which, again, is super sexy about being in music. If when you start off being in music, somebody says, oh, it's all just content, it sounds like it's cat food. But ultimately, the people who are making the best content, the most original content, are the people who are getting the hits online. They're the people who've got the YouTube channels with the most subscribers. They're the people whose videos get the most plays and therefore attract the most attention from all of the players across the music industry, whether they be promoters, whether they be brands who are looking to work with artists, whether they're record labels, publishers, all of the people who you may want to, at some point in your long careers, engage with and work with. And let's not forget the fans, because ultimately, if you're going to be making music for somebody other than yourself, you're going to want to have fans. And how do you go about getting the fans? Having a great song is one thing. Recording that song and having a great track is another. But making a video which 1 million people watch because it goes viral is what will get you paid. So the two key things for me when it comes to product development really are originality, and it applies to music as well as it does to videos, as well as it does to artwork and photographs. You've got to be original for anybody to really care. If you make music that sounds like the next person, if your guitar band sounds like Kurt Weill, if your dance track sounds like Skrillex, if your pop music sounds like Taylor Swift, it really isn't going to work, because people are going to say, oh, that guy just sounds like so-and-so, you know? So try and be original. And also, a less is more approach is probably going to be key in terms of starting out, because you're going to want to engage people, and giving them, splurging out everything you have, making too much is going to be difficult because people don't have time for it. Everybody's attention span is about 40 seconds. I realized that 40 seconds into this speech. But I'm still going, so don't worry. But no, joking aside, people have very short attention spans, and it's really difficult to engage them. So if you give them 10 options to pick between, they're likely to be on to the next thing by that point. They're going to be skirting around the internet, and it's going to be very difficult to capture their attention. If your best track is embedded deep down SoundCloud or deep down your YouTube page or wherever it's living, then people won't find it. And it's going to be really tough for that track to do the business for you that you need it to do. There's a really interesting book. There's a really interesting book called The Manual, which was written by a hopefully well-known, but maybe not well-known, Scottish duo called the KLF. The KLF were masters of pop music in the sense that they set out to subvert the genre by creating pop music out of nothing. They wrote a book about it. They had a number of big hits, more so in the UK perhaps than the US, but they definitely had some success here in the 90s. And the book, The Manual, is really their guide, starting from scratch to how you have a #1 record. And literally, they followed their own advice that they wrote about, and it worked. They had a #1 record. You can get it for free online. If you Google it, it comes up as a free book. I'd really recommend taking a look at it. It's amusing as much as it is informative. And it illustrates a point, which is that you can manufacture music in the same way that you can manufacture anything. One of the main things that you're going to want to think about in your developing music businesses is getting some help. Because we can talk about DIY models. DIY does not mean do it all yourself. It means that you are at the center of the business. You're the core of it. You're the driving force. But if you fast forward from the first time you put a track up on the internet, the first shows that you play, the first tour that you go on, the first contacts that you make, and you're now in business and you're doing it. You're an artist, you're playing shows, you're making music. There's going to come a point where actually you're pretty busy because you're doing a 40-date tour of North America, or because you're in the studio, whether it be a tiny little bedroom studio or a studio with more gear or whatever. You're going to be busy making music. And that somewhat gets in the way of running a business, which is partially why people like me have a job. And so I'm going to talk a bit about building a team. I hope you can read that. I had never really used PowerPoint before yesterday, so this is my first experience of designing slides. I quite enjoyed putting the pictures in, but as you can see, I hadn't totally mastered getting the font sizes right. One of the things about building a team is that they free you up to do the creative work. And initially when you're starting out, you're not going to be able to necessarily work with a large team. There's a lot of people mentioned there, and I'm going to run through like each of them briefly and just. And they're not in a specific order. Like it's not like you'll get a lawyer, then you'll get a manager, then you'll get a publicist. They all do different things, and they all have different abilities to enhance your business. I would say like choosing the right one is better than obviously better than choosing the wrong one. But you're better off with no team than the wrong team. Unfortunately, the music industry is not 100% professionalized, so there are a lot of people involved in it who are not professionally trained and don't have experience. Although that said, when I came into it, I wasn't professionally trained and didn't have experience. So I'm glad that it's not professionalized. Otherwise, I wouldn't be stood here talking to you, and I wouldn't be able to do the job that I do. I initially started out as a music lawyer, and I had gone from being criminal practitioner to music law, and I had a bunch of clients. I had many more clients than I have now because you can pick up so many more artists to work with. And that was a cool thing to kind of learn how to do deals from the ground up, from doing single deals with small labels to doing major label deals for acts that went on to have platinum records. The lawyer will be able to advise you about every type of contract that you're going to enter into in the course of your business dealings. When you're in business and you're starting to make money out of music, you will be presented with contracts. You will be asked to sign things. Based on some experience I had recently with a client of mine who had, before I worked with him, signed a deal written in Spanish with a Spanish publisher and a Spanish record label, which turned out when it got translated, he was not a Spanish speaker, I should add. When it got translated, it turned out to be pretty horrific, and he's still ruining the day that he ever signed that deal. If he'd had a lawyer who was fluent in Spanish and knew something about the music industry, he would not be in the position he's in now, which is that he is probably hundreds of thousands of dollars short of where he should be in terms of his bottom line. So what do managers do? A manager is a jack of all trades. A manager is going to effectively run your teams for you. They're not there to run your business for you, though. Or if they are running your business for you, it's by your permission. It's not to tell you how to do it. You tell them how to do it. We have a very artist-centric policy where the artist is at the core of the business. The publicist is somebody who is going to be super important in terms of spreading what you're doing. It's pretty obvious that you're not going to be able to get your music to Pitchfork and taken seriously unless it's being sent to them by a trusted source. There are many publicists. Some of them are better than others. Ultimately, what I always say to my artists is it's really about how good the music is, not how good the publicist is. But ultimately, the publicist is going to be one of the first people you're going to want to engage once you have your product up and running, because I find that sending stuff from an artist direct to Pitchfork or to Fader or to any of the other online magazines is not very effective in terms of getting listened to. If you go through a publicist they deal with all the time, that is very effective, and it's one of the reasons why there's so much bad music on Pitchfork. I also work as an agent as well as a manager, and an agent is going to be as important to what you're doing as a manager is. The vast majority of artists are making the vast majority of their income from live touring. It is the single most important way of being in business as an artist, although that is not to say that if you don't tour, you can't be in business. There are other ways to make a living in music other than going out on the road and not washing for 4 weeks and ending up with a drinking problem, which is not true of all touring, but it's certainly a risk. The agent basically is the person who goes to the promoter and says, hey, I have this new band. They've never played a show before, but they're really good. And if the agent has a relationship with a promoter, the promoter will give them a door deal, and they'll be able to make 60 to 80% of the gross box office receipts after costs. So effectively, you're going to play your first few shows for free, and that's fine, and the agent won't get paid either because they work on a 10% commission. The idea of getting an accountant may seem kind of bizarre when you're starting out in your artist business, but I can tell you that it's going to be one of the first things you want to do when you have any money coming in. You're going to be in a situation where you're not going to want to deal with it. It's very rare for people who are creative to be really good with money and really good with numbers. It's not impossible, but it's rare, and accountants and business managers are there to help you with that. Likewise, getting a tour manager is not the first thing you're going to do when you're on your first tour. Tour managers can cost anything between $100 a day to $400, $500 a day, and you could get your friend to do it. Likely that person will be the person who is less reliable, perhaps, than other members of the band, and it tends to be that when you're starting out, tour managing yourself is the way forward. But when you build your team, the tour manager will be there, and having a good one is going to save you money. Hiring a social media team is important these days. I actually have not hired a social media team for any of the artists that I manage, but we've built a social media team in-house, and we have a bunch of people doing a bunch of what I consider to be fairly boring but fairly essential work, posting stuff to Facebook, timing the posts, analyzing the data and the feedback we get when we put out the post. So it's a well-known thing that if you post on a Sunday evening, you're going to get less likes than if you post on a Tuesday afternoon. And that seems like an obvious thing to say, but a lot of artists don't know it. And we come in and we say to people that we're working with, why did you post this premium content? Why did you post this new track on a Sunday evening when you got home from being on tour? Why did you not wait till Tuesday? And they were just like, oh, we were so excited. We just wanted to share it with everybody. And the net result of doing that is you share it with no one, and it goes to the bottom of the algorithmic pile on Facebook, and it's a waste of everybody's time. So having a social media team who have some expertise and understanding in how to work with social media is going to be crucial. Distribution is one of the things we talked before about, how record labels are not necessarily the be-all and end-all, and how the DIY model can exist without them. It's pretty hard to get your product to market without a distributor of some description. Even if you can get a direct deal with iTunes, which you can, there are not that many ways of getting a direct deal with every single online provider, whether it be the streaming services or indeed the retail services. We sort of talked about labels, and I'm not going to go into great detail on what labels do. Labels are really changing very rapidly. Labels are becoming service providers. They're no longer the monolithic beasts of the music industry that would sign up your copyright for life of copyright, pay you in advance, and never account you in royalties. I mean, they still will not account you in royalties, and they still are monolithic. But really now they're changing the model that they use, and they're offering all sorts of other bespoke services that you may, as an artist, want to tap into without signing your life away. Publishers are the guys that deal with your songs. There are so many different types of publishing deals. Some of them are really fair, and some of them seem to me to be really unfair. I tend to work with artists who do what's called admin deals. Admin deals are where the publisher really looks after how your copyright in your songs can generate income, and they help you make sure it's chased all over the world, and they make sure that you get paid, and they take a small cut of the income for doing that. Again, these guys are going to come into play further down the line when you have multiple copyrights, when you have a fan base, and when there's an ability to monetize what you're doing creatively. And I put sync agent at the bottom below publisher because it's quite possible that you'll have one song that gets into a commercial. And after you've had that one song in a commercial and you've been paid, something between $10,000 and $20,000 or $50,000, you think this is a really great way of making a living. I could just make songs. I don't have to go on the road. They'll get into commercials, and I'll sit here and I'll count the checks. It's a lot harder than that. I think in 10 years working with over 20 artists, I can probably count on both hands the number of significant syncs that I've had with commercials, films, or even computer games. So it happens for some people frequently, but it doesn't happen for everybody. And it's not something that I would want to make a big part of how I was starting up a business. So distribution is really key to taking your product to market. You've been in your homemade studio, you've taken your $500, you've gone on eBay, you've set your studio up, you've made your tracks, having done your research. How do you start to take this product to market? Well, the simplest way to do it is by looking at something like Bandcamp, TuneCore, or SoundCloud, or YouTube for that matter. There's different ways of putting your music online, and some of that's streaming, doesn't really generate much revenue. Some of that is for sale, and that generates a little revenue, but the model is very much shifting towards music being freely streamed online, unless you're Taylor Swift. And that's fine, if you're able to make money another way. But if you're looking to make money out of selling records, then you have to get a bit more creative. And especially if you're selling records when you're touring, you need to have physical product. I haven't got a slide on premium products. I'm calling it premium because you have to pay for it. But there's a really strong niche developing in creating vinyl or creating tape cassettes, and you can't sell a lot of those because you can't make a lot of those. But if you're going to go on tour, the best thing you can do, as well as giving out details of where you can be found online and on the internet, is to take some product with you, and to take vinyl, whether it be 7-inch, 12-inch, cassettes. I would say CDs, but I just feel like their days are numbered, and I feel like people are going to sort of laugh if you try and sell them CDs, at least in a short time. But there are pretty good options for going online with music. And TuneCore and Bandcamp are two of my favorites. I think Bandcamp is an amazing place to be when you're in the kind of DIY indie world, whether that be as a DIY hip-hop artist or an indie like metal artist, or whether you're making dance music. It doesn't really matter what genre you're in. It seems to me to be the place where all of the indie labels that I really respect are starting to try and sell their music. It's because they give you a better deal than iTunes. On the way in here, we were talking about of the 99 cents that iTunes receives for a download. And I think the artist receives about 16 to 20 of those cents. So you sort of wonder, if the artist makes the music, and you start to wonder why the artist is getting 16 cents out of the dollar, and iTunes is getting about 30% of it. One slide, I will go the right way. So marketing and brand building. for the DIY kind of for the DIY model. The two case studies that I want to talk about are Fool's Gold and Fill My Bicep. You may be more familiar with Fool's Gold than you are with Fill My Bicep. Who's heard of Fool's Gold? Good number. Who's heard of Fill My Bicep? 2? Okay, it goes to show that Fill My Bicep has more brand building to do in the United States than Fool's Gold. And the reason why I wanted to use those two examples are because I've worked with both of those labels, and because they have really interesting ways of doing their brand building. It was really apparent to the principal people involved in both of those labels that they had to build a brand through marketing from day one. It wasn't something that happened as soon as they could afford to do real marketing. It wasn't something that they thought about 2 years into it. It was like literally something they thought about from day one. And I would encourage you, as you develop your interest in music businesses, to think about marketing and brand building from day one. Because if you start doing it 2 years down the line, when you've released an album, it will be too late. You won't be able to change the way in which you're perceived by the rest of the world. Fool's Gold, of course, is A-Track's label, which he shares with his brother, Dave One from Chromeo, and also the graphic artist Dust LaRock. Dust is the guy who has the kind of iconic Fool's Gold designs, and working with a designer is a key way in which you can do your brand building. It doesn't necessarily have to be the most high-end designer in the world. It can be somebody who you know through school. It can be somebody who you find on the internet. It's just got to be somebody whose aesthetic and brand values speak the same language as yours. And what they're going to do is create the visual imaging from which your whole brand aesthetic is built. Both Fool's Gold and Fill My Bicep are predominantly design-led in terms of the marketing. They're diverse. They don't have one specific way of doing their brand building. They go through records, live events. They go through merchandise. It's literally a business which can work in any number of diverse areas. So they're not just focused on touring to make a living. They're not just focused on selling T-shirts either. Fill My Bicep, I should just talk about a little bit because they're one of my current clients. Fill My Bicep are two Irish guys who live in London. They actually don't tour in the States that frequently, which is possibly why none of you have heard of them. But the point I'm going to make is worthwhile anyway. They really started out of a blog. And they're house and techno producers, and they also DJ some disco. And the way in which they started was they had a blog online called Fill My Bicep, and they would make daily posts about rare disco tracks. And it became a hub amongst the rare disco community where they had forums and comments boards, and it became something which was very hip in that world to be featured on that site. And they were DJing a bit, and they'd never really made any tracks, and they started to make some tracks and put up some DJ mixes online, and they started to gain traction that way. And they now do parties worldwide. Their events are pretty much all sold out. They sell limited 12 inches, and when they put out a 12-inch, they sell out of those. It's very much like what I would consider to be part of being a micro business, which is that you're not trying to sell 1 million records. You're making 1,000, and you're trying to sell all of that 1,000 because you know that that's going to recoup your costs and make you a small profit. And if you do that repeatedly, that small profit adds up. You reinvest it. You make some T-shirts. You make some slip mats. And you sell out of those because you're only making a few. And it's the limited nature of the stock that allows people to come back time and time again. They know that there's not going to be any more than 1,000 vinyl made or 200 T-shirts or whatever. Accounting, business planning, and reinvesting. So, again, this is like part of the more boring side of being in business. But when you have money coming in, you're going to worry about this sort of stuff. When you're not turning a profit, it is pretty boring to talk about accounting. But it's key because part of your creativity becoming your business long-term is when you start to ask the question, when can I give up the part-time work? You know, at the beginning of the talk, we talked about how you can fund what you're doing creatively. And I was suggesting getting a part-time job. And that really sounds like a crazy way to talk about setting up a business. But there's going to come a point, whether it's a year or 2 years down the line, where you're going to want to say to yourself, I don't want to work in a bar anymore. I don't want to work in a restaurant. I don't want to do this temping work. I want to go out and do this full-time. And that's when you have to get involved in what's called business planning. And it's when you have to get involved in reinvesting some of what you're earning in building your business. It's really difficult to plan in the music business because success in year 1 or year 2 or year 5 doesn't guarantee future success. But you can still plan for growth, and you can still plan to be in charge of your own business. And it's one of the reasons why giving away rights in your copyrights, or indeed overcooking your marketing, is an issue. You've got to avoid what I call a boom-bust model, where you go all out in the first year of what you're doing to the point where you've made all the compromises you can possibly make. You've signed away all the rights you can possibly sign away, and you end up in a 5-album deal with a major label who doesn't care about what you're doing. They don't care about your musicality. They don't care about your creativity. They've moved on to the next thing that they think can top the Billboard chart. You're left behind, locked in a deal, owning nothing, without any funds. So, that's part of the planning you have to do. When you make a deal, you have to say to yourself, what am I giving away in the long term that maybe I'll need? I would really encourage music business thinking to be based around longevity. Brand building is what builds your fan base. Without your fan base, you will have no business. So, Tolstoy said, the 2 most powerful warriors are patience and time. And that's very true when you're trying to build a fan base. We've talked a bit about the internet, and of course the internet is truly global. But you have to start somewhere, and your business is going to be predominantly a local business in the first 6 months, in the first year, maybe even beyond that. Especially if you're playing live. Real connections are made locally, person to person. Real connections are made touring. And your touring strategy is always going to have to start with where you're based. You're going to have to create networks. Again, it's going to be based around where you live, or where you go to school, or where you're starting out the business. And that's not to say that you have to play 5 times a week in the city that you're based in. Of course, if you don't limit the supply of your live show, you're going to also limit the demand for it. If you play every night, there's going to come a point where people don't want to see it anymore. So you've got to consider how you have a local business in a sensible way. So the internet. Everybody knows about the internet. I don't have to tell you anything about it. The internet's everything, but you've got to see it as a tool. It's a means to an end, and it's not an end in itself. If you see it as an end to itself, you're going to end up in a really distorted reality. All of the tools for your business can be found online. Whether it's the marketing tools, or even the transaction tools, selling your tickets, PayPal, all of the things that we've talked about throughout the whole of this talk. All of it lives online. I found out recently in conversation with somebody at Live Nation that over 70% of their tickets are sold by email blast. 40% of all recorded music income in 2013 was from digital sales. 51%, interestingly, was still from physical. The internet is also the place where the marketing we talked about, the social media that we talked about will exist. You can see here that Facebook and YouTube are really the two biggest forums you're going to have for sharing and popularizing your music. That's a dog starting its internet business. One thing I want to touch on briefly before wrapping up is the idea of collectives. And that's an interesting use of the PowerPoint there with the S on the line below. I hadn't noticed that before. So the power of many is greater than the power of one. Networks and collectives and crews seem to be like a big zeitgeist thing in music industry 2014. Loose affiliations to tight crews. Hip-hop seems to be leading the way from the Wu-Tang Clan to Odd Future. Dance music also sees this trend through the way in which Oustler works. And it's simply because the more of you in the business, the more power you have. Obviously, the more complex it becomes in terms of the difficult interpersonal relationships that you will go through. But doing something solo on your own is always going to be harder than doing it as part of a team. I wanted to touch on the music industry, and how to deal with the music industry and how to approach them. Because I get sent on a daily basis a ton of emails from artists directly to artist reps, some of whom are more professional than others. I see it done really badly. The way in which people send music, the way in which people phrase the emails. My advice, really, in terms of timing, when to approach the mainstream music industry, whether it's managers, agents, publicists, any of the different people that you may want to work with, I would say get up and running first. Don't approach too early. Have something achieved, whether it be in the local market or whether it be on the internet, but have something you can talk about. Going with good music is very interesting for people to hear good music, but it doesn't make you potentially successful. And what people in the music industry are looking for is potential success, not that they can create, but that is happening through momentum already. So go with something that's already working. Don't go before. The format, how to approach, the unsolicited email, the unsolicited demo. I am not against the unsolicited email or the unsolicited demo, but to catch someone's eye when they're busy, when they're getting tons of these emails every day, you don't have to have like a flashing GIF of a dog at a keyboard. Or do it all in caps lock and different fonts. What you have to do is do it really simply and maybe bold the 5 words that are relevant or important. Keep it really simple. But if you're going to send an email, send a link to streaming music. Don't send MP3 attachments. And generally, if there's going to be like a website, just send links. There's no need to send photographs or anything like that. Keep it really, really straightforward. If I were to get emails that just had a SoundCloud link, the name of the artist, and some relevant statistical data, that would be enough for submitting demos. Where to approach? Yeah, the email is a good thing, but also, meeting people out at shows is a good way potentially if you have a good connection with that person. But there's nothing worse than being at a show and having somebody you don't know come and thrust you a demo. It's likely that people are not going to listen to those demos. And so I'm not saying don't do it, but I'm just saying that's not going to be super effective. And then the representation approach is finding somebody else in the music industry who's got those contacts already and who knows those people and who can make those approaches for you. And that's probably what I would suggest overall, like rather than sending demos to labels, to try and find somebody to send them for you. I'm going to wrap up now because I'm pretty much out of time, but the important thing about being in any business is trying to make some money. And that's, I guess, not why you make music, but it's certainly why you go into business. And there are really like 6 income streams that you can look at. The intellectual property you have, the songs, the recordings, those are the things that are going to be not only revenue streams, but they're going to be your calling cards. Touring is the one that is going to be, for most people, the majority of their revenue. Merchandise can be. It really depends on the size of your fan base. What I've found is that artists who have large fan bases can sell merch. Artists who have no fan base, it's very difficult. Nobody wants to buy their merch. Big surprise. What I call the icing on the cake is the biggest kind of development over the last 10 to 15 years in the music industry, which is the involvement of big brands. Brands are not going to make your living for you. What's going to make your living is honest hard work. Brands are the icing on the cake because the brand dollars, the PepsiCo money, the McDonald's money, the Mountain Dew money, whatever, it's like those guys are there when they think they can get something from you. And generally, it's access to your social networks through your fan base. But there's a lot of money to be made from those guys. Even at the startup level, once you have like 10 to 15,000 followers on Facebook or a good Twitter following, you can potentially make brand money from playing branded shows. I'm not a huge fan of working with brands all the time, but there's definitely a happy medium to play. So that's the end of that.